Thank you. In early fall, I went for a walk along the edge of our neighbor's cornfield. The broad green leaves hung onto corn stalks that were topped with tassels that stretched far beyond my fingertips. And as I walked past row after row after row, a gentle breeze whisked through the field, and this is the story I heard. There was once a young woman named Rosita. She was kind-hearted, generous of spirit, and very, very smart. She lived in Spain with her father, who was the oldest and the wisest man in their small village. Now, it was the custom of that time and place for the father to choose whom his daughter should marry. And though the young men in the village came to Rosita's father and asked permission from him to court her, her father refused them all. This relieved Rosita. Her father knew this. But her father worried that his daughter would not find a husband whose heart and intelligence matched that of Rosita's. This troubled him and caused him many sleepless nights, until finally he thought of a test to determine a suitable suitor for his lovely Rosita. The next day he went to her and he said, "Rosita, you like a good story, do you not?" "Oh, Father, you know I do." "Well, have you ever heard of an endless story?" "Father, I have heard many stories, but I have never heard of an endless story." "Then let us have a contest. The one who can tell a story without an end shall be the one to court you." "Oh, Father, that is a story I would like to hear." Her father made the announcement. Arrangements were made for the contest to be held in the main square of the village. On the day of the contest, 100 men, rich and poor, young and old, came from far and near to try for the chance to win Rosita's hand with a story. Each of them thought that they would be the one to tell an endless tale. Some told for days, others weeks, but eventually their stories came to an end. Some stepped forth only to be met by jeers from the crowd. Others were drowned out by roars of laughter and forced to step down. Rosita and her father had nearly given up hope of ever hearing an endless tale when a young man, still dusty from the road, stepped forward. He looked into Rosita's eyes and he said, "I have a story for you, Señorita." While her father scowled and said, "Who are you to think that you can succeed where 100 before you have failed?" Miguel, the storyteller, just held his gaze and looked into Rosita's eyes and he said, "I am only Miguel, a wandering storyteller. I have many and many a tale to tell, perhaps even one without end." Rosita, looking into his eyes, smiled and said, "Then tell your story, Miguel, and I will listen." The storyteller bowed to Rosita and then to her father, and then he began. Long, long ago, there was a king. He was a cruel tyrant who forced his subjects to obey his every whim or be put to death. One day, he ordered his subjects to build a place to store grain. They were forced to work night and day without stopping. The work was so cruel that some died at the foot of the great mud walls, and still the work continued. For 10 long years, they were forced to work until finally the high walls stretched up to the sky so far that the top could not be seen from the ground, and it was finished. Then the king ordered his soldiers to seize all of the corn in the land, leaving his subjects to starve. It took the soldiers twice as long to fill the granary as it did to build it. From season after season, year after year, the soldiers seized the corn from the starving subjects without ceasing. Then there came a terrible drought. The ground turned hard and cracked, crops withered, cattle starved. Some of the farmers went to the king and begged him for a bit of the corn, that he had stolen from them and stored away. But the king's heart was as hard as stone. He refused to help his people. Seeing all that was happening was the king's son. Now, the king's son was the opposite in nature from his father. You see, he was kind-hearted, generous of spirit, and very smart. He was also gifted with the ability to talk to animals. And the prince called to the leader of the sparrow army, and he told him of a small hole high up in the wall of the granary. Now, this hole was just big enough to let the sparrows in and out one at a time. The next day, the king's granary was invaded by the sparrow army, and there was nothing the king could do about it. One at a time, the sparrows flew in through the hole and then out again, carrying away a grain of corn. The sparrows then delivered the corn to the villagers below, and there was nothing the king could do about it. At this, the listeners in the crowd, they cheered as Miguel gracefully described the movement of the birds. Flying up, they took a grain of corn, flying down, and gave it to a hungry villager. Flying up, it took a grain of corn, flying down, and gave it to a hungry villager. By this time, the audience joined in. They all began to chant, flying up, flying down, it took a grain of corn. Flying up, flying down, it took a grain of corn. Are there any Spanish speakers in the audience? Can anyone say that verse in Spanish? No one? Neither can I. But I can do it in sign language. Let's try that. Ready? Flying up, flying down, it took a grain of corn. Flying up, flying down, it took a grain of corn. Nice. Well, on and on this chant went, until finally Rosita's father stepped forward and said, "How much longer will the birds be flying in and out, carrying away grains?" Well, Miguel just smiled and said, "Oh, Señor, the number of birds is countless, and they have only just begun to carry away the grains." Well, Rosita's father frowned, but Rosita, she laughed and she said, "Father, it is obvious Miguel has begun an endless story. Let us not allow him to continue if you should live to see your grandchildren." Upon that, Rosita's father clapped Miguel on the back and said, "Miguel, you are a very intelligent man and a very fine storyteller. Who would have thought there would be such a thing as an endless story?" With that, the crowd cheered, and Rosita and Miguel looked into each other's eyes. Well, Miguel gave up his wandering storytelling, and he courted Rosita. After a time, they soon found that they cared deeply for each other. And over the years, well, they were married, and over the years, Miguel, he told many stories to their children and the grandchildren, but no story was as sweet as the endless story of love that he shared with his lovely Rosita.